Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to the May session of the Marxism and Disability Network. I'm delighted this evening to introduce Ravi Malhotra and Jacqueline Moizer, who will be speaking to us about Crip, Castoriadis, and disability rights in the workplace. Ravi Malhotra is a law professor at the University of Ottawa, a collaborator with Martha Russell, and the editor of Disability in Global Economies, Essays in Honour of Martha Russell. Jacqueline Moizer is a third-year law student, also at the University of Ottawa, and next year will be articling with a labour union. With no further ado, I'll pass us over now to Ravi and Jacqueline, and I will meet you back here at the end for the Q&A session.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Everyone's able to hear me clearly, I trust. There's no problem. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to present this with my research assistant, Jacqueline Moizer, from the University of Ottawa, where I'm a full professor. And this is a work in progress. Crip, Castoriadis, and disability rights in the workplace. The paper is unpublished, so we welcome your feedback. And I look forward to your questions at the end. The way I propose we're going to do this is because this is somewhat different from past presentations in that it's co-presented. I'll be speaking for about 25 minutes, and then Jacqueline will speak for 15, and then I'll very briefly summarize our presentation. That should bring us right to 45. And that's what we have, right? 45 minutes, Luke?
Yes. Sorry, it wouldn't let me unmute for some reason.
Okay. So yeah, without further ado then, this paper is about the notion of Crip time, and it's funded by a Canadian government agency, SSHRC, which provides funding to academics, and it allowed us to have a qualitative research component to this presentation. And we have preliminary findings from these qualitative interviews. So it's a bit of a mixed bag in that it's exploring Crip time, trying to make an intervention on the social model, trying to engage in the work of the radical philosopher Castoriadis, who some may acknowledge as falling within the category of Marxist. Others would vehemently deny this. And then we're going to talk about the qualitative research findings, and then we'll have some conclusions. That's sort of a roadmap of the paper. So, one of the first things is, what is the relationship between social model and critical disability studies, critical disability theory? And so, as Luke mentioned in the introduction, I did edit this book, Disability, Politics, in a Global Economy, Essays in Honor of Martha Russell, and I was privileged when she was still alive to co-author with Martha before her death in Socialist Register. So I'm very much influenced by the British social model, but nonetheless, with the shift to disability justice and a shift towards identity, our insights try to take fresh approaches from the critical disability theory perspective and meld them with the classical work that people like Hunt and Oliver and others did in formulating the British social model. So it's a little bit of both. The American and British social models have quite a different history, with the American approach focusing more on culture and identity. And for those that work in one tradition or the other, I feel that it's often a dialogue where there's not a lot of interaction. That's not completely true. Obviously, Carol Thomas, who died recently, was a great activist. She tried to merge. I'm sure many colleagues in England and Scotland knew her personally. I did not, but people like her worked in both traditions. But unfortunately, particularly in North America, many people are unfamiliar with the British social model approach. And I suspect that not everyone working in the British social model approach is fully conversant with questions of identity. And we sort of try to take both approaches and reflect the lived experiences of the disabled body. the fact that a body is breathing, experiences pain, is gendered, goes through a life cycle, may give birth, or may be a parent, we look at concepts like Jackie Leach Scully's use of the concept of testimonial injustice, which illustrates how disabled people's self-understanding of their bodies is not necessarily accepted. And you'll see that in a lot of empirical work, which I would hope to say one day will be ours as well. But you also see that in the work of Doran Dorfman, many other scholars that do empirical qualitative studies of the experiences of people, say on social assistance. Different jurisdictions use different terms. And I'm not fully convinced with all the British terms, but I think the main point comes across. Their understanding of their own bodies is not necessarily accepted. And certainly if you read Dorfman's work, there's some very poignant analysis in the qualitative work that I believe we cite in this paper. So, where welfare workers, and I think that term is understood cross-nationally around the world, are interrogating people for disability eligibility. And certainly I think people that are part of this group have done pioneering work in this area. Britain has some of the most restrictive, brutal regulations, as far as I understand. So I think this concept will be readily understandable. Dorfman shows how people need to emphasize helplessness and impairment in order to qualify for benefits, even though that does not match with their own self-understanding. And if you read Dorfman's work, you'll see some very poignant descriptions. One specifically that's very poignant is a woman that she spends time talking about how she has to do all this extra laundry because of her incontinence, and she emphasizes this graphic example to ensure that they see her in a way that will qualify her for welfare benefits. Dorfman makes the point, that this really changes people's self-understanding after a while when you're required to portray yourself in a certain way. So how can the social model be implemented? And different people have different views on that whole approach. And in this paper, we take an agnostic approach. We are legal scholars, so this may be obvious to many of you, but some people focus exclusively on law reform. I think many people in the British social model tradition would be very surprised to learn this. People like Paul Hunt and Mike Oliver may be surprised that they're social model scholars and all they do is, in the United States and Canada, is craft strategic litigation all the time. Others take a protest mobilization approach. We sort of say that you need both and that you can work in tangent. So the organization that I've worked with, nothing to do with this project, views are only our own, is the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, CCD, and they take an approach that melds both, a political approach and a strategic litigation approach. And so in this work, where we're trying to apply the concept of Crip time to get new insights for a new theory of accommodation. And if I wasn't clear at the outset, that is sort of the foundation of the project. We want to take an approach that sees different ways of looking at the social model. It's not one thing or the other. And strategic litigation often involves cause lawyers that actually do press conferences, that actually do activist work, you'll actually see legal conferences where they might take time off, conferences of lawyers, and then go to a political demonstration while at the conference. That's literally an example that someone communicated to me very recently. It literally is true. So, it can be both, but people that choose one path or the other are often dogmatic about it. And so in this project, we're sort of looking to see how people empower themselves. As qualitative research, we don't pass judgment. We try to look at their lived experiences. And we're influenced by the work of Munger and Engel, who wrote the book Rights of Inclusion. That was a book entirely about Americans with disabilities, none of whom engaged in litigation whatsoever. And so Ms. Moizer will talk more about the qualitative side, but we didn't have this hard rule that nobody could do litigation in order to be in the study. But it's interesting, if you read Munger and Engel's work, and I don't think it's well known outside the United States, just the fact that legislation had been passed changed the way people conceived of their identities as disabled people, even though they had never engaged in the litigation. Okay, so to be utterly clear, I'm certainly by no means the originator of the concept of Crip time. I think that's obvious to everyone, but I want to be clear about that. And I think there's a little bit of ambiguity on the founders, so people can correct me, but I attribute it to Ellen Samuels and Alison Kafer. There may be others around the world that have also worked on this, but they're American scholars that have brought up this idea of Crip time. And when I wanted to formulate it, I sought out this funding grant, which I also hope will be a book from the British publisher, Bloomsbury Academic, on Castoriadis, and I'll talk more about him in a minute. Doing this book on Crip time, I thought it was a good way to tease out issues around accommodation because it affects so many different aspects, and it serves as a way to operationalize, we thought, a radical conception of the social model. And it's simply, if you're not familiar with the term, and I suspect most of you are, it refers to the way disabled people experience time. It doesn't just mean the bus is late, and it can mean that for those of you that have experienced in paratransit, but can also mean the fact that since the rise of capitalism, wage labor is tied to productivity. People who are unable to work full time are stigmatized. And certainly, one person told me, and I try to remember, I don't know if this is a literal quotation or it's an apocryphal comment, but someone told me that one of the best examples of the realization of the law of value as articulated in volume 1 of Capital is the exploitation of a first-year associate at a law firm. And so that's a sort of we're lawyers, this is a bit of an in-house joke, but it literally is true. It's true for a lot of professions. And this may not be welcome news for those that are just about to embark on a legal career, but it's literally, you're billing by the hour, your partners in a private sector firm, in-house, working for a union, slightly different, but a private sector firm, the partners make more money for every 10th of an hour you work. I mean, it's a direct example of this. And so disabled lawyers, and our study is not confined to that, although interestingly enough, we did have a lot of people, legal background, that volunteered for this, are particularly at a disadvantage. This is especially true for those that have fluctuating impairments. So people that have certain kinds of conditions, sometimes with mental health conditions or multiple sclerosis, various conditions where they fluctuate, employers have a hard time understanding why this person is perfectly fine one day and not the other day. But it affects many different things. It can also affect pain levels. Person may experience pain, that may fluctuate. Activity levels may fluctuate. Strength and coordination, concentration, all may fluctuate. And this becomes particularly challenging for employers to accommodate. And so people that have these impairments, engage in strategies in order to deal with that. And as I said, we'll come to this when we talk about the qualitative component. So here I have this bad habit of anticipating my own slides, but Alison Kafer says, Crip time bends the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. And that's quoted in a very elegant piece, which I strongly encourage those of you that don't know it, by Professor Samuels, Ellen Samuels, who has a piece on Crip time that's full text online. You just have to Google From Disability Studies Quarterly, the premier journal in American disability studies, and I highly recommend it. And so they've developed a theory of Crip time that acknowledges how disabled bodies are different and experience time in a unique way. And so here we have this quotation from Professor Samuels: "For Crip time is broken time. It requires us to break in our bodies and minds to new rhythms, new patterns of thinking and feeling and moving through the world. It forces us to take breaks, even when we don't want to, even when we want to keep going, to move ahead. It insists that we listen to our body minds. so closely, so attentively in a culture that tells us to divide the two and push the body away from us while also pushing it beyond its limits. Crip time means listening to the broken languages of our bodies, translating them, honoring their words. So our work is pedestrian. It's legal analysis. It's not written in this very beautiful, elegant way, but I think this conveys sort of the beauty of the concept of Crip time and sort of asks us to rethink this, And so one of the examples of this is eligibility for services. If you want to operationalize this, and I think this is true across jurisdictions, you could be a disabled person, and the fact that you qualify for paratransit, door-to-door specialized transportation, does not necessarily mean you also qualify for attendant services, at least not in Canada. And what's particularly bad about Canada, which I know is different from the United States, is that we don't even have a federal law that regulates this. So if you move from municipality to municipality, you could qualify for paratransit in one municipality, but surprise, surprise, you moved 50 kilometers away, you're no longer eligible, and you have to go through a degrading, demeaning test where they literally watch how you walk in order to assess whether you qualify for a service that's chronically late, underfunded, and that you have to book well in advance. The stories about paratransit are legendary, and I think are across jurisdictions, but Canada is particularly bad. And so across jurisdictions, but also across services, you have this time crunch for eligibility, and qualifying for eligibility, which is a gateway to employment, takes time. The fact that you have this for paratransit doesn't necessarily mean you'll have it for attendant services. And all of this takes away for opportunities for work and leisure, from opportunities for work and leisure. So in this slide, I think I've largely already said this, but if there's a message here, it is that with the rise of capitalism, E.P. Thompson's written a very famous article about this, with the rise of capitalism, that, we say it in our paper, the bottom line is time is money, right? And so it's an opportunity cost for wage workers. It's also a cost for service providers, and disabled people are an afterthought. Paratransit is chronically late, and all of this takes away from the quality of life of disabled people, people with disabilities. We're going to use terms interchangeably, and keeps people with disabilities out of the labor market and marginalized. So you can see on the slide some of the problems, and attendant services, have some of the same issues. Of course, the thing about attendant services, not only are all of these barriers existing in order to book, but to become eligible, but they're also literally, and again, British scholars, I think, have done pioneering work on this, but they're minutely examining exactly how much time they're going to give you. Why? Because time is money. And again, I think people in this audience know this, but they'll actually break down how much time does it take to put on a sock or to put on a bra or this kind of thing. That, as you can imagine, is very degrading, but it's very much a factory model. And certainly my colleague and friend Suzanne Stoltz has written, and I believe it appears in the chapter that she wrote for my anthology honoring Marta Russell. She wrote a very beautiful piece about disability activism in a MDA, or muscular dystrophy, summer camp. And in that summer camp, they were actually regulating the bowel movements of campers, supposedly for safety reasons, but they would actually post the bowel movements of campers publicly. Many people find that degrading, and they would monitor it. And it just shows you to the maximum degree how much literally moments of disabled people were regulated down to their bowel movement, and the impaired way that they defecated is stigmatized and regulated by time. So it's an extreme example, but when you start looking for it, you see time everywhere. Law has proven to play a limited role in regulating these services, at least in Canada and the United States, which I'm more familiar with. It's very difficult to challenge regulatory agencies' decisions on paratransit eligibility or eligibility to attendant services. It's not impossible, but it's pretty close to impossible. It's very difficult to challenge these things, partly, at least in Canada, is because there's no way to fund attorneys or lawyers or barristers to litigate. There's no money in it, so nobody litigates. So there's a need for a class analysis, because even more so than employment, it leaves disabled people to lead marginalized lives. Service providers are not required to foster human flourishing or some sense of a good life. And because of that, you have disabled people are left in a marginalized state. We also have the reality of neoliberalism, a topic I think which is close to the heart of many of you. And so here we've looked at the work of Hartmut Rosa, a German scholar, about how the pace of life is accelerating. However, Crip time does not necessarily mean all disabled people work at a slower pace. In suited conditions, it may well be that the time pace accelerates. It just depends on the context. And again, I've already alluded to the fact that disabled people may experience intermittent conditions, so their experience of time fluctuates, but the pace of work in many contexts is accelerating, leading to more causalization of labor and more stresses and anxiety, which further complicates inclusion for disabled people. Then you have the COVID-19 crisis, which I think is on many people's minds. It's been seen as an opportunity for disabled people as work has shifted to home, although now there's a dramatic pushback. And recently in Canada, those of you that follow Canadian labor news saw we had this in a major national strike be an issue. And the union won the strike, the Public Service Alliance of Canada, to some degree, but I think did not get very substantive language on remote work enshrined in the collective agreement. So remote work is going to continue to be a hot potato in labor disputes for the unionized sector, particularly in European countries. Sadly, for American colleagues, it's less of an issue because very few Americans are actually union members. But it's 7% in the private sector. I think 6%. It's declining. At the same time, many communication tools like Zoom are not necessarily responsive, and I think we all know this, for various accommodation needs. So that creates a problem as well. So I've got limited time, but I do want to say a few words about Castoriadis, and I think we're on schedule if I keep this reasonably short. And so then I'll turn it over in a few minutes to my colleague. So I always wanted to work on Castoriadis, and so I proposed this book project, and I won this SSHRC grant, national government agency in Canada. And Castoriadis certainly was a Marxist, and he played a leading role in the French group Socialisme Barbarie. Many of you may be more expert on Castoriadis, have more expertise than I do, but he's most famous, well, he's famous for many things. I would say he's most famous for his work, The Imaginary Institution of Society, but many people have their own Castoriadis. So he was this Greek-French polymath, similar in many ways to C.L.R. James, published in French. And for those of you that read French, I highly recommend the DOSSE biography. I don't know if it's been translated into English yet, Castoriadis in V. It's a comprehensive biography of Castoriadis. But in a nutshell, he combines psychoanalytic theory with a Marxist framework and makes some interventions on a social imaginary signification of time, which is just his way of articulating a new way of imagining, new ways of being. And there is scholarship, secondary literature on time through the prism of Castoriadis, not very much. So I saw an opportunity to propose this book that I'm starting to work on. But we started with this paper, Jacqueline and I, to get our feet wet, that incorporates these qualitative insights in order to formulate a new theory of disability accommodation, embracing Crip time, based on both Castoriadis and our qualitative research, which is in progress. So Castoriadis is well known for his emphasis on ancient Greek societies and direct democracy, and how that we need to look back to them. I don't pretend to be a philosopher. I could not articulate Castoriadis in philosophical language. For those of you that are experts on Heidegger and Wittgenstein, it's way above my pay grade. But he developed this idea of social imaginary significations that answers the big questions of society. What's a society for? Why does it exist? And so, the idea that American society is about markets, many people won't even question that. It's just seen as normal, just as in some decades ago, gender norms were seen as normal. This is not an endorsement. It's just the idea that you're a woman. 1950s, you'd go wear a skirt. You wouldn't think about it. That was the dress code. It was ingrained. And social imaginary significations, new ones, contest that. And so whether it's feminism or Crip time, these sort of theories, challenge what Castoriadis calls in simplistic identiary logic. Again, the Castoriadian jargon is intense. Go read Susie Adams. Go read the Castoriadis secondary literature if you really want to deep dive in this. I'm not going to torture you with Castoriadian jargon, but it's based on a combination of theories he derives from Aristotle and mathematical logic theory from the work of Cantor. So he challenges this traditional logic built by Aristotle and Cantor and tries to argue that you need radical imagination. Radical imagination is going to set us free. And so he combines class analysis that he got from his days in Socialisme ou Barbarie, Socialism or Barbarism, in the 50s and 60s, and builds in the 70s this new imaginative theory of an autonomous society. And he distinguishes between an autonomous society and a heteronymous society. And he sees the vast majority of societies, including the former Soviet states. Castoriadis is famous for his quip, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, 4 words, 4 lies, very much an anti-Stalinist. So he sees his heteronymous societies as ubiquitous, and they deny the capacity of ordinary people to transform the world through auto-creation or creation ex nihilo. I don't have time to get into all the philosophy, but the idea here is that auto-creation, autonomous creation, allows new ideas. And this is where we hope, that Crip time could be this idea that we use to build a better theory of a duty to accommodate that's more sensitive, more accommodating than after the fact. So Castoriadis says, being is time and not within the horizon of time. So that's sort of a building on Heidegger instead of, being and time. He says being is time, has the idea of time as creation. And scholars such as Shishminos have pointed out that in revolutionary periods, like in France and Russia, you had transformations of the calendar. And so you had societies building new calendars, creating new holidays to reflect the new society. And in a minor way, you see that certainly in Canada and other settler colonies in celebrating national days of truth and reconciliation, or Martin Luther King Day in the United States. And there's contestation around that with conservatives in both those societies opposing these new holidays. You see that also in the contestation over gay pride months, where, corporations are going in and trying to commercialize gay pride, and some GLBTQ activists are saying, wait, hold on, we're skeptical about that. And so, so I've already talked about the work of E.P. Thompson and the rise of capitalism. Castoriadis says capitalist time as a time of accumulation and of disasters is the reality. And in that, you could say by decades, early 1970s is when he wrote The Imaginary Institution of Society. He anticipates the work of Naomi Klein by some decades. And so as Marta Russell and others have shown, the rise of the factory system excluded disabled workers who could not keep up with hourly or even minute-by-minute production targets. So just looking at the, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to summarize the Castoriadis part. I'm going to skip over the scholarly analysis of case law, because I don't think it will be very interesting for this audience, but I'm happy to answer questions about it in the discussion period. What I will say before I turn it over to my colleague is that there's a dramatic shift in technology, And so there's an expectation that workers are always going to be online. In the legal world, there was a huge Twitter battle. And I know some professors actually lectured about this in class, where an American law firm associate was lambasted all over Twitter because he posted a presentation, a training module that was leaked to the press for in-house or for his associates in-house. And it was saying things like you're online 24/7, no exceptions, no excuses. That was one bullet point of all these draconian things about you're working at Paul Hastings, you're in the big leagues, you're basically expected to work 24 hours a day. Not only is this troubling from a feminist point of view, and I haven't had time to talk about, there's a propensity for or possibilities for alliances between gendered caregiving and Crip time, but it's degrading and gross in general. This is a very 1950s way of running law firms, and it's sort of the antithesis of what my colleagues tell our law students. So it's disheartening to see that. But I don't think it's atypical at American and British law firms, as well as Canadian, and has negative implications for work-life balance for all workers. And I use law as an example, but this is true, I think, for all the professions, and it's going to be especially concerning for disabled workers. Okay, so I'm going to skip over the law, and I'm going to shut up and turn it over to Ms. Moizer to talk to you about the qualitative aspect of our project.
Great, thank you, Professor Malhotra. Okay, so the study funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council involved interviewing up to 24 disabled Canadians and their experiences in the workplace. So last summer, we conducted focus groups that were divided by gender identity and ranged between 3 to 7 participants from Ontario, Canada. And the project was advertised online and through disability justice organizations in Ontario. And the focus groups also took place virtually, which eliminated a lot of barriers to participation that might be caused by travel, in addition to being a COVID-safe way to conduct focus groups and interviews. So as a grounded theory study, the aim of the focus groups was to facilitate open-ended discussion on participants' experiences with disability, accommodations, and workplace requirements of time, to enable community involvement in developing the themes to be explored later in the individual interviews. So over the course of the fall and winter, we conducted 16 individual interviews, also virtually. These interviews were semi-structured in the sense that we had a list of questions, but the interviews generally followed the direction and narrative of each participant. In terms of our approach to coding the data, we used in vivo software to analyze transcriptions from the focus groups and the interviews. Our codes were generated from a combination of the research guide and the data itself, and our code list evolved as the study progressed. Coding was really a collaborative process between myself and the other RA on the project and Professor Malhotra. We would each do a sort of second pass on coding on each other's work because we might see the data in slightly different ways through our own perspective. And after interviews were conducted, we would also write individual memos, recording some of the key themes that arose during the interview, as well as some of our thoughts on how the interview went. And these memos were also helpful in identifying new themes and patterns as the interviews progressed. Next slide. I think it's, okay, they look to be out of order, but it's okay. So the findings so far that, so the interviews so far, have resulted in some really interesting findings with respect to disability, time, and law. And it's not pictured here on the screen, but I've identified two sort of overarching groups of themes that I'd like to talk about. So the first is that across all interviews, many barriers to accommodation were identified, in particular with respect to disability law, ableism and stigma against disability, and job class, meaning whether someone is full-time, part-time, or on a fixed term contract. Second, participants shared a lot of insight into time-related barriers in the employment context, also in access and accommodation and in everyday life. And here time was understood in multiple ways. So the need for more time was identified, but also that the experience of time was different due to living with a disability. And as I will discuss, transportation was one significant time barrier for many individuals who participated. Could you actually go up one slide, Professor? Thank you. So one question that we asked all participants was about their thoughts on the importance of disability law. And since we're in Ontario, Canada, we asked whether they were familiar with the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or the AODA, the Ontario Human Rights Code, and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The AODA was enacted in 2005 and aimed to identify, remove, and prevent barriers for persons with disabilities in all levels of government, public sector, and private sector businesses in Ontario by 2025 through standards and regulation. But as one participant, Rosemary, shared, quote, "People don't follow the AODA. I don't know what fines or penalties, like who is actually enforcing this, who is actually holding the employers accountable." So even though there are standards that employers are supposed to be meeting with respect to accessibility under the Act, there's a lack of enforcement on employers who are not meeting their requirements to accommodate and be accessible. And another participant, Andrea, also noted the limits of the law in terms of enforcing equality rights. She said, quote, "Why bring a complaint to the Human Rights Tribunal if there's no enforcement behind it?" Pointing to the fact that the opportunity to pursue judicial remedies is limited, and that the remedies themselves are insufficient to actually meaningfully redress discrimination. Next slide. Oh, one up. Sorry, slide 31. Thank you. So ableism and stigma against disability was also a consistent theme across all of the interviews. For Ruth, this stigma was a barrier to requesting accommodations because, quote, "I don't want to make things difficult, or I don't want it to impact expectations or opportunities." Assumptions that accommodations were a sign of laziness contributed to both exclusion in the workplace and hesitancy to ask for accommodation. For many participants, the stigma led not only to not requesting accommodations, but also choosing not to disclose disability at all, particularly for those living with quote unquote invisible disabilities. So for example, Mason shared that it's still highly stigmatized to have a mental health disability, and that disclosing this in the workplace can lead to questions about a person's capacity to work, which in his view would have a direct and negative impact on his opportunities for professional advancement. Next slide. Great. So one theme that emerged as the interviews progressed was the significance of job class in accessing workplace accommodation. This was interesting because we hadn't necessarily anticipated a connection between job class and accommodations in the interview guide that we had created, but many participants noted how important having permanent employment was in terms of their comfort levels in seeking accommodations. So for example, Alana shared that she would absolutely seek accommodations if she were permanent, but currently does not feel confident requesting accommodations or disclosing her disability because she's on a fixed term contract and it's unsure if that contract will be renewed. So there's a time-related aspect to this as well. Blake noted that he never felt comfortable taking a leave of absence from work because he felt like this would disadvantage him in competing for a permanent position. So he felt like he couldn't access time off from work. And in his experience, this was compounded by the fact that his career was shortened by his disability. Interestingly, the barriers that were presented by job class also led many participants to specifically seek out work in certain sectors. So many noted that they chose specifically to work in the public sector, where there was a better work-life balance in terms of hours, more stability, and better benefits like health insurance that were necessary to pay for assistive devices, for which the cost can be really prohibitive. Some also chose to work as entrepreneurs or as self-employed. so that they could have the kind of flexibility and time in their day that was not available in traditional employment, and particularly in traditional part-time or temporary employment, where participants have even less control over their working hours and working conditions. Next slide. So this provides kind of a nice segue into a discussion on some findings regarding time. One theme that emerged in the interviews was that participants benefit from having more time to do tasks or more flexibility around deadlines. For Peter, more time for tasks is an important accommodation that allows him to manage his health, disability, and work in a way that meets expectations. But not every employer recognizes that time can be an accommodation at work. For example, Monica said that organizations should recognize that it does take people longer to do certain things, to get certain places, or to achieve certain tasks. So it's not just about the time it takes to meet deadlines, but also the additional time it takes to get to the workplace, move around the office, or remember to take medications, attend doctor's appointments, etc. Next slide. This is why an understanding of Crip time can be so beneficial in employment and accommodations, because as many participants like Alana identified, it's not necessarily how much time tasks take, it's about all the things around work that can create a deficient quality of time. So the idea that even if you have enough time outside of work to spend with family, friends, and community, it's not good time because you're exhausted from working. And also, all the additional time that's invested into managing or living with a disability contributes to a feeling of having less time at work. Crip time was also reflected in participants like Mason, who noted that everyone interprets and uses time differently depending on the circumstances of their bodies and minds. And Jordan also identified that they experience time differently. But employers don't recognize this because time is understood from an able-bodied or neurotypical perspective. And they said that letting people manage their own time would be an important accommodation for workers with disabilities, but employers don't see time as an accommodation. Next slide. Another time-related barrier in the workplace that came up in the interviews is the fact that accommodations requests often aren't processed or responded to within an adequate time frame, meaning that disabled workers are waiting for a long time to be accommodated so that they can do their jobs. Andrea said that the duty to accommodate must be done within a reasonable amount of time. Workers should not be waiting until after the fact to be accommodated or included in the workplace. This is really getting at the fact that workplaces are not designed with disabled people in mind. So accommodations are an afterthought, and the time that it takes for requests to be responded to creates barriers in the workplace. Timeliness issues in accommodations also arise because of the entrenchment of the medical model, as discussed. Ruth shared that employers often want certain documents as part of the accommodations request, and they want it weeks in advance before the accommodation is needed. In this way, workers with disabilities bear a temporal burden of organizing medical evidence and documentation to request accommodations that they need in the future, instead of employers working with employees in the present to address ongoing needs. Next slide. So commuting and transportation was one of the most significant time barriers to working that was mentioned across all interviews and across all participants who commuted in many different ways. So for example, Alana drives to work because public transit takes too much time out of her day, but for her, driving is a high stimulus environment that affects her cognitive functioning throughout the workday, therefore impacting her perceived productivity and experience of work hours. I also note that many participants shared that public transit is just not an option for them, not only because of the amount of time that it takes to use public transit, but because many subway stations aren't accessible, like they don't have elevators, for example. Blake was one participant who relied on paratransit to get to and from the workplace, so a door-to-door public transit service for persons with disabilities. He said that the most difficult part about using paratransit is the subtle humiliation of having to wait in the lobby while your coworkers are passing by. And he said that he spent a great deal of time waiting for pickup to go home from work. The problems with the paratransit system were also highlighted by Andrea, who shared that she often uses her scooter to commute because she can't regularly access paratransit, because as Professor Malhotra noted, it's an underfunded, first come, first serve booking service. But during the Canadian winter in particular, Andrea had to rely on colleagues to carpool because her scooter would get stuck in the snow that wasn't plowed on the sidewalks. So overall, the disabled experience of time, or Crip time, is really illustrated by the specific experience of commuting to and from the workplace across different modes of transportation. Next slide. So something we were interested in asking participants about was about how COVID-19 has impacted their experience in the workplace. And many of them discussed their experiences with the shift to remote work in a really positive way, and how this benefited them in terms of alleviating time-related burdens from commuting, non-work related stressors, and overall just creating flexibility, stability, and more time in the day for both work and non-work related tasks. Danny shared that he noticed almost immediately that he had more energy working from home, which led him to have more time outside of work to spend with family and friends. Monica agreed that her productivity was best while working remotely because the time-consuming aspects of in-person work were removed during the pandemic. So not only the fact that she didn't have to spend time navigating a hostile built environment, but she also gained the time back that she previously spent planning her day and managing her disability while working. Overall, many participants felt that they had more time or better time to manage responsibilities outside of work while working remotely, or when not having to deal with that temporal burden caused by commuting. All of which supports the idea of reframing workplace accommodations in terms of Crip time. So those are the preliminary sort of findings, and I'll pass it back to Professor Malhotra.
Okay, so I imagine Luke wants us to shut down. By way of conclusion, I will simply say that they're a work in progress because the paper is a work in progress. So we don't have explicit conclusions that are set in stone, but I think some of them will include reconceptualizing what it means to be productive and building alliances with other groups such as parents that might also benefit from a different understanding of time and respecting the reality that not all disabled people could work full-time, or in some cases more than full-time. So we need to have social systems that accommodate this and value people that work part-time. And this sort of accommodation, a robust theory of accommodation, would avoid litigation, which is exhausting for anyone, but particularly disabled people. And for those of you that are not familiar, litigation could go on for years. A Castoriadis theory, bolstered by our qualitative research work, we hope will assist in reformulating a new theory of accommodation that will empower disabled people. Thank you so much for your listening.
Thank you very much, guys. That was a wonderful presentation, and I'm sure that we're going to get some really interesting questions. I'm going to start with two apologies. Firstly, I need to apologize to Jacqueline for mispronouncing her last name. I am so sorry. I put the I in the wrong place. Please accept my my prostrating myself in shame. Secondly, colleagues and comrades have made it clear to me that actually we do tend to record the question and answer session. So unless there are any strong objections that I receive shortly, I'm going to leave the recording running for that. With no further ado, if anyone would like to raise a question for Ravi and Jacqueline, then please either use the hand raise reaction. You get that by clicking on the reactions button in the bottom bar of your Zoom screen, or alternatively, you can turn your camera on and wave your hand around and I will see you. I'm not seeing any questions so far. So just while people have the time to think about that and brew some questions up, I'm going to abuse my position as chair. I have two questions that I wonder if you guys might like to respond to. The first of those is how your understanding of Crip time changed over the course of doing the qualitative research. You mentioned there were a couple of findings there which you didn't expect. And I wonder whether they were unexpected because you guys just hadn't anticipated them, or because there was something in the theoretical literature that that kind of left them out or made them seem unlikely to you. And the second is around the different kinds of Crip time that appear in the critical disability studies literature. I think you guys were really clear in your presentation that there's a kind of Crip time which is almost kind of seen as being part of the individual. You know, I have this impairment or this condition, and therefore I experience time differently. And there's another sense of Crip time which is fostered upon us, you know. So time is a social imaginary, the time of the workplace, the time of the bureaucracy. To what extent do you think that those two understandings of Crip time work well together, and do you see any tensions within them, or between them rather?
Okay, well, I'll start, and then Jacqueline can jump in as she deems fit. I'll take the second question first. That is fascinating. The whole idea of an official, Crip time and sort of a Crip time from below. Put it, if you want to put it that way. There's sort of the official, the medicalized Crip time, and I feel that there's a tension because I don't think individuals set out to have a day. Well, I'm having a social model sort of day. Kind of people's consciousness is mixed in their own head, I think, and perhaps Jacqueline can collaborate on this. But it seems to me that people have frustrations that may be a more individualized thing, but then when they think about it, or through political experience, some people, maybe not everyone, but people over time start to see these as more political. And suddenly, and I come back again to COVID-19, because COVID-19, I suspect, is a pivotal moment. I feel that's like a pun, but it's like a pivotal moment in the history of Crip time, in the sense that we were told for years and years, and as a legal scholar, I can tell you, at least the American term, and I believe the British term is comparable, would be undue hardship. And so working from home, I can guarantee you, in most cases, for almost, I'm not going to say any job, but many jobs, they would laugh you out of the tribunal, or they'd laugh you out of the court if you were to argue that your accommodation is working from home. But you have an empirical problem after COVID-19. The empirical problem is you have the lived experience that, wait a minute, people just did this. They taught online, and I'm not saying university or college classes were perfect online. I think there's problems with that, but not just university teaching, office workers, all these kinds of workers that were deemed essential, that bosses, managers said the workplace will collapse. But it turns out that when you have a pandemic, it actually is possible. In clinical, there was one grievance I read from electrician workers, and I never figured out how electricians were able to work from home. I never figured out the workplace context. All I did was read the grievance. But it's, talking about electricians, there's a whole lot of workers that can work from home. Maybe they were fixing lines remotely. I'm assuming that's what they were doing. I don't know the details of how that grievance went forward. But on that, I would say that I think that people had mixed consciousness. And I don't know if Jacqueline wants to add anything to that point.
I can comment on the first question, actually.
Sure.
If that's okay. Which is about how I think you're getting at how I mentioned we were surprised that job class was, or at least I was surprised that came up as frequently. Professor Malhotra was probably not as surprised that came up, but I'm newer to this area, so that's probably part of the reason why I was surprised. But also, we hadn't included a question in the interview guide about it, because when we were selecting participants' eligibility, the fact that they had been working was one of those criteria. But as we continued doing recruitment, we noticed that many individuals who were participating were maybe recently employed or were in precarious employment and had a lot of thoughts on difficulties in accessing stable work. And I didn't address this as much in the presentation, but Professor Malhotra did mention that many disabled workers face difficulty in managing full-time work. They would prefer to work part-time. And so in addition to creating more avenues for permanent and stable employment for persons with disabilities, I think we also need to create security in part-time or non-traditional forms of work so that individuals can feel secure requesting accommodations, or they feel like they won't face reprisal in asking for accommodations. Remote work and technology is also something that came up a lot more than just sort of the impact of the pandemic. And we did interview many professionals. Actually, a lot of lawyers indicated interest in participating in this study, but there are many forms of work that are not amenable to working remotely or working from home. And one participant did mention that technology can also exclude persons with disabilities from the workplace. The example they gave was the manual checkouts at the grocery store as one form of technology. It's sort of contracting out to technology jobs that would be previously good jobs for some workers with disabilities. And I had previously thought of technology as a really, mostly in a really positive sense in terms of working from home and creating more flexibility. So that was also another thing that surprised me throughout the interviews. I think that answered your question. I'm not sure.
It did. That was wonderful. Okay. Thank you very much. We do have a question from the chat. Just before we get there, Ravi, you do know you're still sharing your screen, right?
Oh, do you want to stop it?
I was going to say, so we can see you trawling through the slides. That's fine. That's not a problem. But just as long as you know that's
happening. I can stop it if it's. I just thought it might be helpful at some point, but that's no problem.
Okay, cool. So we have a question from the chat. This is from Emma. And Emma, feel free to turn your mic on and jump in if you want to add to this at all, or you want to respond once Ravi and Jacqueline have given an answer. But Emma wants to know how you're thinking about Crip's time's roots in and relationship to queer theory.
Oh, that's a great question. So we certainly have acknowledged the focus on the body. And so in the first part of the presentation, I talked about the American tradition, and it's focused more on the phenomenology of the body. And certainly a lot of that definitely is engaged in queer theory. I don't know that in the draft we have so far that we've written extensively on this. So that's something that we can build on, but it's certainly something we're cognizant on. And certainly Kafer and Samuels have built, on principles of queer theory. But I think that we highlight it in terms of distinguishing between the sort of the UPS, the Union Physically Impaired Against Segregation, that sort of more class-based model, and the sort of more identity model. But I think Crip time we're hoping is a concept that can sort of build bridges across the two. But certainly when we write about phenomenology of the body, I'm going to have to take a closer look at that.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Ariana, I see your hand if you'd like to come in now.
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much, Ravi and Jacqueline, for an amazing paper. And I'm really looking forward to reading the article and to seeing how your work about rethinking what it means to be productive is going to tell us, because I think I really enjoyed the combination of the British social model with Crip theory, which is something I always look out for. Yeah, so thanks so much. So I have two questions, and you can choose not to answer, or just you can pick the one to answer. I think one connects to the idea of deficient quality of time. So thanks, Ravi, for scrolling the slides, because I didn't have the right phrase. Because I really liked the focus on the impact that requesting accommodations or work-related activities had on the time, on the quality of time outside the workplace. And I was wondering whether and thinking that in relation to the point about the political consciousness that comes after the initial frustration. I was wondering whether that perception of a deficient quality of time being created by all these by the encounter between Crip time and all the work-related activities, and whether it led, whether from your interviews, whether it leads to a refusal, a kind of a refusal of work intended in any way, whether dissatisfaction or solidarity building or any kind of, or even just at the level of refusing this impact on life outside work. So this is the first question. So yes, about that impact, that deficient quality of time, yeah, in relation to a political consciousness and refusal of work. And I think the second was maybe kind of similar to what Emma was asking. How about whether you've been considering other dimensions, for example, the sphere of social reproduction, so alternative ways of organizing relationship, maybe or queer communities and kinship, as opposed to social reproduction in a traditional family household. Yeah, so I was wondering whether the insights that you've been drawing from the workplace, whether you think they are applicable to other areas that maybe are more flexible in terms of their organization and the possibility to request accommodation just because of their informality. And this is, I think, connected to the point about a job class and the difference that you were identifying between a permanent secure employment and more precarious spaces. Thanks so much again.
Okay, so should I answer that at this point, Luke? Go ahead. Okay, so if I understood the question correctly, it's about refusal to work and consciousness. I mean, in a nutshell, is what I understood the question to be about. And, you know, again, perhaps Jacqueline might have more to say about this, but what I would say, you know, as the principal investigator, is that I think that when you do these small scale samples, you sort of, and our work is underway. I chose to present this as a genuine work in progress in terms of the rating, but work in progress in that the qualitative interviews are not, data collection is not yet complete. And certainly I've got lots of funding, so well, hopefully we'll do more going forward. But I would say that, you know, it was not set out to be an interview of a bunch of lawyers. That was not what the project was intended to be, but a lot of it tended to be that way. And so I think that because a lot of the participants were either lawyers or they're working for the federal public service, and I'm not going to sort of categorize people's consciousness by impairment. I don't think that's appropriate, you know. But what I would say is, I think that a lot of people were sort of in the grind, that they've been doing this for a long time, and so they weren't necessarily articulating a radical conception of consciousness, Now we did have younger participants, but in that case, in those cases, they didn't necessarily have extensive work experiences. And one of the things about the study, a methodological choice that I made at the outset, was to interview people that had labor market experience. A more non-traditional scholar might have made a different choice, might have actually opened it up to anyone and asked them to select activities that are of value to them. That's a very different way of proceeding. And we didn't strictly regulate. We didn't kick people out when we discovered that they actually don't really work very much at all, and they're really on social assistance and they're working a little bit. So we kept them in the study. We didn't have hard and fast rules, but we did have a rule that these were people that had labor market attachment. And because of that rule, I suspect that we got participants that had a more conventional way of articulating this. This is my theory anyway, and it's difficult to generalize when you've got 16 participants. We don't have 1,600, we've got 16, but my suspicion is that people, did not really have this sort of radical consciousness because they'd been in the job for a while. Some of them acquired their impairments later in life, which is always an interesting factor to look at. And so they were just trying to get by, and they weren't necessarily this is the way it's always been, and working was an important part of their identity. Sort of taking it out wasn't really feasible because of their commitments. I don't know if Jacqueline wants to add anything to that.
I don't really have much to add other than it didn't really come up too much in the interviews, but I think it's something that could be asked about in further interviews. I think I noted the study was for up to 24 interviews and we've done 16. So kind of, as I said, that the questions and the themes developed as we did the research and evolved. I think that could be another question or area to ask participants about in the future. So thank you for that.
I'll pass over to Joanna now.
Thank you, and thank you, Ravi and Jacqueline, for this excellent presentation. I was wondering, how do you think trade unions could make use of your insights from these projects? Do you plan to engage with them to influence their approach to time? And do you have any views on how trade unions in Canada approach time? Thank you.
Oh, well, that's a wonderful question, and it brings up points I wanted to raise. I briefly mentioned the Public Servants Alliance Canada strike, which involved over 100,000 workers and was a successful strike, according to the union, at least the union leadership. I don't know how rank and file members feel, but it got a letter of understanding on remote work. And I'm reading today, this is extremely recent, that the remote work letter of understanding may or may not be grievable. I'm reading from conservative media. I'm not convinced, but conservative media is reporting that remote work provisions are not going to be grievable. And so we'll have to see. But certainly, I think in Britain, England, Scotland, Canada, United States, anywhere there's a union, collective agreement negotiations, I would think, I can't speak for British people, obviously, but I suspect remote work is going to be something on the bargaining table, and that you're going to want to enshrine that. The other thing is that I have to say, and I didn't get a chance to mention this before, along with part-time work is useless unless it comes with comparable benefits. So unions need to negotiate benefit packages, and that means every kind of benefit, from extended healthcare to massage therapy to psychotherapy to pension benefits. All of that needs to be prorated, and that hasn't necessarily been something that's been high priority for unions. And I suspect for some unions, particularly male-dominated unions, there's a masculinity part. Again, I'm not an expert on gender theory or queer theory, but I suspect that these overwhelmingly male unions have been ambivalent about part-time work, and that has to do with, well, many issues, but one of them is the association of, I think, feminization of labor and part-time work. Part-time work has been stigmatized and feminized, and so lots of unions have not really been, I think, on. But now, post-COVID, and frankly, post-economic collapse, whatever. I mean, I think unions are at this stage, and again, the German or British context may be different, but I really doubt that's the case. I mean, I think the crisis is global. I don't think the current British government is particularly soft on neoliberalism. I think cuts are proceeding everywhere. And so unions are going to fight back. It's going to have to be high priority. But in terms of the actual narrow question, yeah, we're committed. My team is committed to making presentations to whoever's listening, including making it available to unions that are interested in our findings. Absolutely. In plain language reports, that's something that we've already committed to doing.
Fabulous. So I don't see any hands at the moment. I would encourage anybody to please put a hand up. I'm forced again to abuse my position as chair, for which I apologize, but one must. So I want to ask a little bit about some of those methodological choices that you guys made, and particularly around the recruitment of participants. You said early doors that you perhaps got more professional class workers than you expected to through the door to begin with. I was wondering if you guys could reflect on why you think that was. I mean, the thing which is really striking for me is that disabled workers tend to be kind of overrepresented, often in the lower pay scales of manual or semi-manual work. So particularly, I only know kind of Britain and Germany reasonably well, but care workers, for example, so low-paid women workers in general tend to have an overrepresentation of impairments, either work-related or not. Similarly with unskilled sections of the construction trades. So I was wondering, from that standpoint, why, whether you think it's pure chance, or whether you think there was any particular reason why the respondents to your call for participants tended to be skewed towards professional job classes and professional wage classes.
I think it's simply the way we did the recruitment, which has had financial constraints. I think originally we used legal networks in order to access clients, but had the accidental effect of the lawyers that were on the mailing list were interested. And so I think it's nothing more complicated than that. And in terms of using electronic methods of recruitment, I think we were simply less successful in getting a broader class. If I had to do it again, I might rethink this sort of thing. But it's challenging in COVID times. Our methodology is also Zoom, which frankly is a COVID method. So we did Zoom interviews. That's a choice. Some would argue that that's also exclusionary in other ways, but that for the researcher, that presents difficult choices. 15 years ago, I wrote a different book and did qualitative research. And in that case, my RAs and I did in-person interviews. And Morgan Rowe and we wrote a book on qualitative research that Routledge published, exploring disability identity, disability rates through narratives. But I think the COVID pandemic, not just for ourselves, although yes, I'd like to not have COVID, but also for the safety of participants. I don't think we had any realistic alternative, but that did constrain the Zoom methodology, and the method of recruitment meant that I think we got suited types more professional workers, and I'm not sure what the best way would be to counteract that short of having in-person interviews, and that has a whole set of disadvantages as well as advantages.
That's fantastic. That answers my question perfectly. Thank you very much. Jay, I see your hand next.
It's Julie, sorry.
Julie, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I just have Jay. So I was thinking about, we were talking about one of the purposes, let me see if I have this right, is building bridges between the social model and maybe, I don't know if it was a critical disability theory that focuses on lived experiences. Is that right? One of the purposes of the study is overall is to build those kind of bridges between the social model and a model that's focused more on lived experiences and critical disability theory. And I was wondering, I'd be interested as you proceed in this research, about also the connections that you are going to make or might make between Marxist disability theory, capital M Marxist disability theory, along the lines that Marta Russell, her writings, for instance, Roddy Slorax, etc., and these other theories. One of the things I was thinking about that is that, you had mentioned, Ravi, something about when you were talking about the shift to capitalism and surplus value extraction, that it kind of makes me think about Rosa Luxemburg and reform and revolution. The relationship of reform and revolution, if you're talking about legal changes and laws, that could potentially be reform, which to my understanding, AKA Rosa Luxemburg, does not exclude revolution. So kind of throwing that out there, partly as food for thought, because I know you're continuing.
Well, thanks. We'll definitely take that into consideration. And certainly the focus here has been on Castoriadis, but as I said, obviously I'm familiar with Marta Russell's work, and so I think you mentioned some other theorists, but I didn't catch their names. If you want to put them in chat, you could. But I certainly we will work to build on that, moving forward.
Thanks very much. I don't see anybody's hand up. Have I missed anybody? Or does anybody have a question they'd like to jump in with now? Oh, Julie, your hand is raised again. Is that a legacy hand, or do you have a follow-up question? Oh, I'll take that. That was a legacy hand in that case. Okay, and there's nothing in the chat. What I'm going to suggest we do in that case is that I'm going to stop the recording now, or at least I'll pause it.
Yeah, I think my question, which builds on Joanna's about trade unions, and I think connects to other questions as well, was whether you've got any engagement or response from other disabled people's organization or activist groups. You were mentioning, Ravi, at the beginning, that there is actually there is an overlap and a linkage between the experiences of people doing litigation and them being at demonstrations. So yes, I was wondering whether you've got any response or engagement with disabled people's organizations and activist groups, but also if you think what you think about the ways in which the usefulness of your model for them. Thanks.
So I understand the question correctly. You mean the insights of the theory or the recruitment model? I'm not really sure.
Just the theory itself and basically your insights into Crip time.
Oh, right. Well, we are workshopping this now. This is, this. Some people were asking in the chat about publication. It's unpublished, and so in that process has only just begun, and recruitment isn't over yet. We still have more interviews to do. I hope to be able to do that going forward, but we're still at an early stage, so I don't have that. I don't have that yet because we haven't really. This is one of the first opportunities we've had to present this work.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ariana, and thank you very much, Ravi and Jacqueline. I do not see any further questions, so I'm going to wrap us up now. Thank you again to our presenters for a really wonderful, really rich, and really engaging presentation of their ongoing research. I'm sure I'm not the only one who is very grateful that you guys chose to share it with us. And we look forward to hearing how the research progresses and to reading the end results all in due time.